Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Everything Vaguely Paranormal. I am Ryan Roberts, and these are my partners in the paranormal, Shelly Pruitt, Blake Smith. How we doing tonight, y'all?
Doing
Ready
pretty
to hear
good.
about this. Ready to learn something about Kurt Cobain.
Been anticipating this one for a while now since we brought it up. I'm excited.
Because he wasn't really in my wheelhouse, but I don't know anybody that hasn't heard of Nirvana or hasn't heard of the grunge rock movement. So yeah, I'm excited to learn some stuff about this, but there is a conspiracy around it, so you know I'm all about that.
There is a conspiracy, and we'll get into that like pretty hardcore here later on. But you know, I wanted to do this topic because Kurt Cobain was one of Kurt Cobain and Nirvana was like one of the first bands I was like really into, and they had a huge influence on my life. And had I not found them, I don't know if my musical taste would have been the same, because it kind of led me to other bands and other genres that I had never really experienced until I started listening to them and reading about everything that went into the band and their influences and things of that nature. What are you going to say, Blake?
I hear a lot of people say that, especially a lot of people who have like the same musical taste that you do. They start off with that and they're like, I wouldn't have found this, I wouldn't have found that if it wasn't for Nirvana. So
I mean, I wouldn't have found Black Flag, I don't think, and Black Flag's one of my favorites. You guys see me wear the Black Flag hat a lot. I'm not wearing it tonight. I'm actually wearing a Misfits hat, but I wouldn't have found the Misfits either, because contemporaries of all that. So huge influence on me. So I decided I was going to kind of delve deep into Kurt Cobain, and we'll just go ahead and get started because it's a pretty big topic. And
heck yeah, let's do it.
So Kurt was born on February the 20th, 1967 in Hockwayne, Washington. And he was born to Donald Cobain and Wendy Friedenberg. Now, Donald ended up working at the Chevron station in town, while his wife, Wendy, ended up staying home and watching their brand new son, Kurt. And Donald, through working at Chevron, ended up saving up enough money for them to buy a small home in Aberdeen, Washington on East First Street, where Kurt would spend a lot of his youth off and on. Now, by all accounts from his family members and everyone around him, he was a very outgoing little boy. And his aunts and uncles paid lots of attention to him, and his whole family loved his good nature and enthusiasm. They just said he was just a joy to be around. And he was especially enthusiastic about music from a very early age. And his aunt and uncle were actually in a band. And so the family would go over and hang out with the aunt and uncle a lot. And Kurt was just fascinated. And he would sit at their feet and watch them jam in the living room and just love every minute of it. And his aunt had a pretty big, extensive record collection. And whenever he would go over, he would always ask if he could listen to what they were, whatever new records they had gotten. And they would play them for him. And he was, a little boy running around singing the records that he'd listened to that his aunt and uncle played for him. And his parents kind of picked up on the fact that he really was into music. So his mom and dad, when he was I think he's about 7 or 8 years old, bought him one of those little Mickey Mouse drum kits. And he would play that thing all the time. And his sister said that they would sit around, they would listen to the radio. And as he listened to the radio, he could play any song he heard. He would just bang it out on that little drum kit. And as he was listening to the radio and as he was getting in the music, he was starting to get into his own music, even as a kid. And eventually begged his mom and dad to buy him his first single, which was Terry Jack's Season in the Sun. So that was a far cry from what Nirvana would be later on. But, just a little bit. Yeah, that was just that little earworm, he had to have in his little record collection. But eventually he got really into the Beatles, and they became a huge influence on him that you could eventually hear in Nirvana's songwriting and the way they structured their songs.
I wonder who got him into the Beatles, because the Beatles is definitely not his era.
He was born in 1967. Yeah, so not too long after that. I think probably his aunt and probably like everyone around him was probably a Beatles fan, so he probably got into it that way. But up until he was about 9 years old, everything was all right. His parents were together, and but they occasionally fought like young parents do, because they had him when he was kind of young, and he was still happy and he was still living with his mom and dad, but he could not fathom what was coming next, because one night Wendy told Donald that she wanted a divorce and stormed out of the house and left Donald to explain to him and his little sister what a divorce was and why he would have to be leaving soon.
And so he was 9 years old. He was born in 1967. So that means that would have been around 1976. That was still pretty unheard of for females, I mean, for divorces, but for females to leave. Normally it was the guy who left.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, this would actually become a really big sticking point for him and would kind of shape him for the rest of his life, because in 1974, in March of 1974, a month after his birthday, his father packed his bags and left, and moved into the next town over. And this whole ordeal really hurt Kurt deeply, because, his identity of his sense of self and his identity was kind of tied to his family at that young of an age. And the precocious little boy that everyone loved and who was super outgoing and jovial became very inward and became very withdrawn. And he himself said that when his parents were divorced, he felt like he just wasn't worthy of love after that. He felt like he, maybe had something to do with it. He felt like he just felt embarrassed, and and he felt just so much isolation because his mom and dad split.
I remember, that about 78 or something, I had a friend that got divorced, and everybody's like, oh my gosh, their parents got divorced. And it was a big deal even then, and moving right into the 80s, that was still like something that was kind of taboo,
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm a child of divorce, so I know how that is. It is, it's very. I mean, luckily I was about 16 when it happened, so it wasn't as impactful. But it still affects you somewhat.
I was gonna say you and I are on the total different sides of the spectrum then, because where you were later, I was way earlier. I was only 2. I don't know, somewhere in there.
My son was 6 months old when I divorced my husband, because I never wanted my kid to know what it was like to have us both together, because it would not have been good memories. So
yeah, it was. I mean, it was rough, and Kurt, like I said, he retreated into himself and became very inward. And he actually, shortly after his dad left, went into his room and scrawled on his wall, and it was there for a long, long time. Quote, "I hate mom. I hate dad. Dad hates mom. Mom hates dad. It just makes me want to feel so sad. Mom sucks. Dad sucks." So he was kind of going through it. He just didn't really know what to do.
Poor kid. Yeah.
And he also didn't really have time to process it, because as soon as his dad moved out, his mom moved in a new boyfriend. And the new boyfriend was actually very abusive to him and his sister. Kurt described him as a, quote, huge mean wife beater. And he immediately began disciplining Kurt Cobain. And when when Kurt wouldn't move, whenever he wanted him to move as fast as he wanted to move, he'd slap Kurt in the back of the head. And Kurt had never dealt with that before, because he had a pretty stable childhood up until this point. And he went and he told his mom about the abuse, but she would never listen to him. She never seemed to care about it. And this left him feeling more so withdrawn, because he felt like he was being abandoned by the person who was supposed to take care of him. And she just didn't seem to care. And whenever he would bring it up, she would chalk up his accusations of abuse up to jealousy of the new boyfriend living in the house. So Kurt was really going through it, and nobody would listen. And soon he began acting out at school, because, what do kids do when they don't know what else to do? They began acting out and lashing out at others. And his mom and stepdad couldn't do anything. Well, not stepdad, but mom's boyfriend couldn't do anything with him. So, they would kind of leave him by himself and not really bother with him. And whenever they would go out, he would start calling his dad and begging his dad, "Hey, can I please come live with you? This is what's happening over here." And he yearned to be anywhere other than under his mother's roof with that abusive boyfriend. And finally, his dad eventually relented, and Kurt went to come live with his father. And Kurt's dad was actually very happy that Kurt wanted to come live with him. And it really touched him deeply, because he was like, he didn't think that his kids wanted to come and stay with him after the whole divorce thing. And he wanted to do right by Kurt. So when Kurt moved in, he bought Kurt a mini bike, and him and Kurt would go on camping trips, and they would do a lot of father-son things. And Kurt was starting to come out of his shell again and starting to feel good, because he felt like someone actually cared about him, and they were doing great things together, and he was having a really good time. But then again, right before his 11th birthday, things shifted. And this is kind of on Kurt a little bit, but this is also like a kid kind of dealing with a lot of family turmoil. Because Kurt's dad had been seeing a woman. And Kurt's dad told him, "Hey, I'm going to marry this woman." And Kurt did not want that to happen. He wanted to keep his dad because he felt like he was getting all of his dad's attention, especially after being attention star from his mother, it seemed like.
Well, and after he'd been with Mother, who the person that she had brought in was not good to him, I'm sure there was a bit of fear about who Dad's going to bring in isn't going to like me either.
Exactly. Now, Kurt would be gaining a stepmom and a couple of step siblings. And Kurt, like I said, he didn't want that. He felt lost again, and he felt like he didn't want to share his dad with anyone. And Kurt's stepmom, by all accounts, was not a mean woman. She actually came in and tried to encourage his artistic endeavors and tried to be nice to him and everything, but he just didn't seem to take to her whatsoever. And he just did not like her. And reluctantly, he moved into a new house with his new family, his stepmom and his step siblings. And because he didn't like the change, he began to act out again. And he began to bully and antagonize his step siblings for no good reason, and made fun of their appearances and even pulled the heads off of some of their toys. Now, Don and his wife were at their wits' end. They really didn't know what to do with Kurt, but they didn't want to give up on him. So they kind of did what they could to make him happy if they could. And his dad kind of suggested that he take up the wrestling school, take up wrestling at school to kind of give him a bit of a direction and kind of give him, something to do.
An aggression outlet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not only that, but probably some discipline as well.
Yeah. So by this time, Kurt was in high school. He had gone to high school, and like I said, he was acting out against his siblings. So his dad suggested that he join the wrestling team, and Kurt did it because he still desperately wanted his dad's affection. But he was also still holding deep resentment for his father because his father remarried, and he came up with a plan to embarrass his father while he was on the wrestling team. So Kurt's dad had been walking around telling everybody about how Kurt was on the wrestling team and was doing so good, and he was going to do good in this wrestling tournament.
He was proud of him.
He was very proud of him. But since Kurt was still resentful of his father, when it came time to actually do stuff at the wrestling tournament, whenever the whistle blew, Kurt would lay on his back and grin at his father while he got pinned every single time in every single wrestling match. So this was enough to send Don through the roof, and he said, "That's it. I've had enough of you. We've done everything we can to support you. You have got to go." And this kind of started the shuffling around of Kurt for like the next 3 years. He didn't stay anywhere for too very long because he would be shuffled around from family member to family member and just never really had a permanent home. And no one really wanted to keep the troubled teenager for too long. So the first thing he would do, they would send him off. "Well, you got to go live with your uncle now because I can't deal with you. Well, you got to go live with this aunt because I can't deal with you." But one of these stops, Kurt ended up staying with his Uncle Chuck. And his Uncle Chuck got something for Kurt that would define Kurt for the rest of his life. His Uncle Chuck saw Kurt was turning 14 and Kurt needed an outlet. And Kurt was a really good artist. He was like, he loves music, so I'll just buy him a guitar. And Kurt cherished this guitar. He spent every moment he could.
Uh-oh.
Ryan froze.
Crap, I'm sorry.
There you
go. Okay, sorry. Kurt spent every moment. We got weather in Texas, y'all. So
yeah. Welcome to Texas.
So, but Kurt spent every moment playing this guitar. He absolutely cherished it, and he actually ended up learning how to play B-52 songs and Led Zeppelin songs and playing them really well. And he just cared about playing music, and he didn't want to stop ever. And around about this time, after he started playing guitar for a long time, for a little bit of time, he discovered something that he absolutely needed, and that thing that he discovered was punk rock. And he actually moved back in with his dad when he was 15 years old. And his dad told him, "If you're going to stay with me, you have to play for the Little League team in town." So Kurt, that summer, played for Little League. And on the team was a guy named Matt Lukin. And Matt Lukin was the bass player in a band called the Melvins, which I still love the Melvins. Melvins are fucking awesome. If you haven't listened to them, go listen to them. So,
that's just a shameless plug right there.
Absolutely. So he was in the Melvins, and Kurt and Matt spent the whole summer sitting on the bench talking music together and playing baseball. And Kurt was also friends with the lead singer of the Melvins, whose name was Buzz Osborne. And this was Kurt's window into a brand new thing because the Melvins were super into punk rock and new wave. And that's how Kurt kind of got into it, because Buzz began loaning Kurt all these magazines and all these like clippings and books that had all these pictures of all these punk rockers in it. And Kurt saw it, and it was absolutely wild. And he was like, it was like pure artistic expression. And that's exactly what he wanted and what he needed. And so Buzz would let him also borrow like his punk and new wave cassette tapes. And Kurt had never heard anything like that before. And it was exactly what he wanted. It was the perfect amount of rage covered with coupled with pure artistic expression. So Kurt began getting his hands on anything that he could that pertained to punk rock. He began dressing like a punk and hanging out with the Melvins all the time. And then it happened. Black Flag was coming to Seattle. Seattle was a couple of hours down the road. That was the closest they were going to come. The Melvins were super into Black Flag. Kurt was super into Black Flag, but he didn't have any money to go. So what does he do? He sells his music collection in order to go see Black Flag. But it was completely worth it for him because it was absolute ecstasy. It was everything he had been looking for in music. And he knew right then and there, and he said to himself right then and there, this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. So the day after the Black Flag gig, Kurt goes back to Aberdeen, Washington, and he cut his hair like a punk. And he began hanging out and running around town with local punk rockers, and they would spray paint punk slogans and punk logos all over buildings in town. And
they were little hoodlums.
They were little hoodlums, but Kurt had finally found his tribe. He finally found the people he had been looking for.
Side note, Rhonda says she met the Melvins at Graceland.
Oh, no way. That is
Side
awesome. You have to tell me that story next time I see you, because that's really cool. But in 1984, Kurt was finally able to have a little bit of solace and was finally able to move back in with his mom for a little bit. He was about 17 years old and convinced his mom to move back in. The only problem was his mom had a new husband at this point.
Oh, so the abusive boyfriend is gone now.
Yeah, he's gone. He's gone now.
Somebody else. Okay.
Yeah, we got somebody else. Somebody else his mom is with. And this boyfriend was not too keen on having a punk rocker living in his house. But he convinced his mom. His mom talked to the husband, and the husband was okay with it, so he moved in. And things were okay for a little while until Kurt's mom's husband came home drunk one day. So he comes home drunk, and Kurt watches his mom get into a fight with this guy. And Kurt's mom takes every single gun that this guy owns in their house, walks down to the Wisgo River, and chucks all the guns into the river.
Come on, mama.
Yeah. So Kurt immediately.
She might have known what she was doing.
Yeah,
maybe something. So Kurt immediately hatches this plan. He's like, I really need a new amplifier for my guitar. So I'm going to go down there tomorrow. I'm going to fish every single gun out of the river. I'm going to go sell it in town and buy me a brand new amplifier.
Nice.
So that's exactly what he did. Him and his buddy go down to the river, fish out all the guns, go sell it to somebody in town. Kurt buys a brand new amplifier, and his buddy buys a pound of weed. So
I'm guessing there was no gun background check stuff, no serial number check. Yeah, you got to get in the cell. What are you? 16? Yeah, sure, whatever. Give me the gun.
Yeah, so Kurt, was putting his money towards something else. This guy was putting his money towards, having fun. I think they actually ended up splitting it, though, because Kurt was like, hey, it was my gun, so maybe I can get half of that. But shortly after this happened, Kurt and his mom got into another fight. And Kurt left his house and went to go hang out with the Melvins. And when he returned, he saw all of his stuff sitting on the front porch. And his mother was standing there with her arms crossed. And his mom told him that, she didn't need him around messing stuff up, and he needed to leave. So Kurt grabbed everything that he could and left, and didn't really have anywhere to go, but he was able to scrape up enough cash with another buddy of his to find a very, very small apartment and move all of his stuff in. Now, with nothing else going on, Kurt not having a job, Kurt not having anything to do, he got really serious about his music and began writing his own songs. And he convinced Dale Crover, who was the drummer in the Melvins, to come and play drums with him and another friend, and they formed a band, and they called themselves Fecal Matter. So,
of course they did.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, teenage boy, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
So they called themselves Fecal Matter, and they actually went to Kurt's aunt, the people who Kurt used to go watch jam, and they recorded a demo with his aunt's equipment. And Kurt began making copies of this demo and handing it out to the people who were hanging out around the Melvins. Now,
where was he at this time? Is he still in Washington, or has he moved to Seattle?
Okay, he's still in Aberdeen at this time.
Okay.
Now, and this is how Kurt ends up meeting Chris Novoselic, who would be the bass player in Nirvana. So now Kurt knew Chris from school, and Chris would hang around the Melvins, and Kurt handed Chris his demo tape, and Chris was absolutely blown away by what he heard. So he asked Kurt, hey, do you want to start a band? And Kurt was like, absolutely. And the seeds of Nirvana began to form. But they didn't call themselves Nirvana yet. They don't call themselves Nirvana until later. But they were starting to kind of get that thing
develop the sound.
Yeah. And Chris told Kurt, hey, I've got a place we can actually practice. I've got a space. My mom owns a beauty shop in town. And there's like an empty apartment above my mom's beauty shop. So we can go there and practice. And every afternoon, that's exactly what they did. They practiced every single afternoon. And Kurt wanted to get really good because this music thing seemed to be the only thing he was good at. And he just wanted to get the hell out of this small town and get away from these small-minded people who keep trying to stifle his artistic ability. And he wants to get the hell away from his parents.
You know that had to be fun for his mom, though.
Oh yeah, she's got the blue hairs in there.
That's in the blue hairs are.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
You're like, it's loud in here.
What's that god awful racket up there?
Turn it down.
So shortly after that, they got their first gig. And Kurt, Chris, and their drummer Aaron Burkhardt played a live show at a small party in Raymond, Washington in March of 1987. Now, the people who were at this party were not impressed by their antics whatsoever, because Chris at the party goes into the medicine cabinet and starts digging through their medicine cabinet, finds fake blood, and covers himself in fake blood before they start playing. And not only did he do that,
I love this.
When they start playing, they're standing up in front of the room. There was a window that was open to the side. Chris keeps jumping through the window and running back around, playing the bass a little bit, and jumps through the window again, runs back around. And they played their show, and the people were like, "Get the fuck out of here! What are y'all? I don't know what y'all are doing. Y'all are freaks. Get the hell out of here."
I love it though.
I don't know who keeps fake blood in their medicine cabinet.
I was about to say.
That's a good question.
It's very rando, but
yeah, absolutely.
Somebody just popped in and said, "Wait, who keeps fake blood in their medicine cabinet?"
Yeah, see, that's a detail. I didn't miss that detail.
Yeah, I didn't either.
I have kept it underneath the sink of the bathroom with like the Halloween makeup.
Yep.
But never in the
my
medicine cabinet.
I mean, maybe it was just fate. It was there for fate.
But why the hell
it's
that
here.
fool
Why
jumping
not?
in and out of the window and dragging his fake blood all through the house? No wonder they got thrown out.
I love it.
Yeah, they got thrown out, and but Kurt didn't care, because Kurt was just happy that they had a show underneath their belt, and he felt like he was on cloud nine. He was like, "Cool, I played a show. This can be a real thing." So he was on cloud nine, but Kurt knew that his brand of art was less than accepted in the area that he was in.
Yep,
so he wanted to get out of there. And luckily, the capital city and college town of Olympia was pretty close, maybe about an hour and a half away from where he was from. And that was the home to Evergreen College. And it was a more friendly artist community. There were more punk rockers, and people were like really into music there. So Kurt was like, "I'm blowing this popsicle stand. I'm going over here."
A college town.
And on the weekends, he would accompany Chris to go to Olympia. And on one of the visits, Kurt ran into a woman named Tracy Miranda. Now, Tracy was a friend of Buzz Osborne, and Kurt had Buzz introduce them. And Kurt soon began staying in Olympia every weekend with Tracy, shacking up with her. But while he's doing this, he's forgetting to pay rent back home back in Aberdeen. So
of course he is.
he got to leave, and Tracy was more than happy to have Kurt move in with her. So Kurt moves in and begins living in Olympia, Washington. He's finally found like a little artist community that he can express himself and be himself in. Now, this is when they get their first real gig, because Tracy knows a guy who owns a place called the Community World Theater down in Tacoma. And she goes down there and she gets them their first gig. She convinces them to book them. And I think there was maybe like 10 or 12 people in the audience, but everyone who was there said they were absolutely blown away by what they saw on stage.
I was about to say, because
Yeah.
their antics and that name, the Community World Theater,
Yeah.
that didn't really merge too well.
I say, but they were blown away, and they ended up garnering enough buzz from that gig that they were able to play more gigs under various names in the Tacoma area and back in Olympia. And a couple of names that they tried out when they first started playing were Ted, Ed, Fred, Pincap Chew, and Skid Row.
Interesting, because
Yeah.
didn't Skid Row come on in the early 80s? There wasn't, I mean,
Well, I don't know if like I don't know if what Sebastian Bach Skid Row. I don't know. Like, I think that was about the same time, but maybe I don't know if they knew of them at the same time.
That's interesting that you have two people with, hit bands that contemplate the same name. One of them takes it, one of them does not.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, Fecal Matter, Skid Row, Dookie Demons,
Yeah, all that. It all ties in one way or another.
Fecal Matter and the Dookie Demons.
On Skid Row.
That sounds gross.
Now, about this time, things were starting to gain a little bit of traction and were going great, but there was just one problem in the band. Aaron Burkhardt started missing practice. So Kurt was like, hey, this is do or die for me. I want to be a serious musician. We got musician.
And I can make you disappear.
And said, and he was like, this is do or die for me. I don't have a job. This guy has a job. I'm focusing all my time and energy and what little money I can get into this band. This guy is missing practice. He's going to party with his friends. So we got to get a more serious drummer. So they ended up kicking Aaron Burkhardt out of the band, and they find another drummer, but they can't find one that is serious enough that they want. So Kurt called his old buddy from the Melvins, Dale Crover, to come in. And he played drums for them again for a while. And in October of 87, they were practicing with Dale Crover to kind of, do more with him. So Kurt being so focused on the band allowed him to write a lot of good material that year. And he would stay at home all day while his girlfriend worked. And she actually supported his art because she worked at the Boeing plant. And she was like, hey, I'm making enough money. You can stay home, do your thing. So he would work on art projects and write a lot of songs, and he really wanted to get them recorded. So he found an ad for a studio in Seattle that charged only $20 an hour for recording. And him and his band members scraped up enough money and booked the session for January the 23rd, 1988, and they recorded their first professional demo for $152.41.
Heck yeah.
Wow.
And
that's awesome.
Kurt was through the freaking moon about this. He's like, hey, I've got an actual professionally recorded demo.
They could have just gone to the mall in the 80s and done that in one of those little booths.
One of them more booths.
I only would have cost them $59.99.
Yeah,
$49.99.
So, but this is when he starts to feel like a real musician. I almost said magician again. And the recording engineer on that session was a guy named Jack Endino, and he really liked what he heard. So he was able to pass it to a friend of his named Jonathan Pohlman. Now, Jonathan Pohlman was the co-owner of the Seattle indie label Sub Pop Records, and they're still around today. You can still get stuff from Sub Pop Records. You go to the Seattle airport, there's a whole Sub Pop store. Sub Pop kind of survived because Nirvana gave them the money too at one point. So Jonathan passes it on to his buddy Bruce Pavitt, who was his partner at Sub Pop, and they loved the demo so much that they wanted the band to record for their label. So they reached out, got them a show, and arranged to put out a single for them. Now, Kurt by this point had decided that they were going to call themselves Nirvana because, if you're going to be on a record label and you're going to be printed on an album, you got to figure out what your name is. You can't be 5 different names at this point. So he figures out that they want to be called Nirvana, and Dale ends up leaving the band, and they end up finding another drummer named Chad Channing. And they go into the studio and they record the Love Buzz single for the Sub Pop release. And the band started to get heavy airplay on college radio, and Kurt heard his song played for the first time, and he was absolutely elated because he couldn't believe that his art was making it out to other people and that he was actually being heard after trying for so terribly long to be heard. Now, Sub Pop thought that the success of Love Buzz was so great that they wanted Nirvana to record a full-length record, but they couldn't afford to pay for the record, so the band had to come up with their own money to record that record. And for $606, the band ended up recording Bleach in December of 1988, and that was Nirvana's first release.
And again, you could have gone to the mall, $59.99.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, $59.99.
And as Rhonda said a while ago, gotten a glamour shot too.
That's right. Had their album cover done at the same time.
Dude, I remember one time my mama got glamour shots at the mall. We were there forever. Sorry, Mama, I had to call you out, but anyway. So Sub Pop ends up releasing Bleach in June of 1989. And Sub Pop books a U.S. tour. And Kurt is very happy because he's seeing the country for the first time. He's having a great time. And he's touring with a band. And he's just stoked to be getting his music out there. But after a while, the cramped conditions of touring in the van, and Kurt all of a sudden having a really bad stomach ailment, which we'll get into a little bit later, Kurt began getting frustrated with bad PA systems at all these different venues they were going to. And so he began smashing his guitars and smashing and jumping into drum sets and smashing amps and everything else because he was just so frustrated with everything. Now, they come off the road in late summer, and they're immediately informed that, hey, we booked you a European tour. So already exhausted from the U.S. tour, they have to go to Europe and do the same thing. But in Europe, it was a bit different because in Europe, they were freaking rock stars. The gigs were sold out every night. People had found out about them and loved everything that they were doing. And, you know, could not believe how famous they were over there. But some of the same frustrations from the U.S. tour came about, and Kurt's stomach ailment began bothering him really bad, where he had chronic pain in his stomach, he said, and he would vomit a lot, and he couldn't hardly keep anything down, and it was something that plagued him for most of his life.
Did he have an ulcer?
Eventually, a doctor figured out that his scoliosis was pinching a nerve or pinching part of his stomach, and actually, he claims the reason that he started using heroin in the first place was because of his stomach issues, because that's the only thing that could quell it, because he could not do anything other than that to help it. That's what he says. Mm-hmm. But back in Europe, Kurt is smashing a guitar almost nightly, so he's starting to cost Sub Pop money. And things come to a head in Rome when he has a nervous breakdown on stage. He climbs to the top of a speaker stack, threatens to jump off. And then as the speaker stack collapses, he jumps into the rafters and grabs a chair and threatens to throw it down on the crowd below. And
the crowd probably ate it up and thought it was part of the show.
Probably.
Yeah. I wonder if whenever he got up there, whenever that speaker stack fell, was anybody in the crowd hurt? Seems like I remember something about this story, but I don't recall all of it.
I don't know. Maybe they parted the sea fast enough as it was falling because it was so big. But I don't know. I think everybody was okay except for him because he was eventually talked down out of the rafters, and he finished the tour and went back to America. Now, Nirvana returned from this tour, and they went to work immediately on more material. But they didn't have the intention to stick with Sub Pop. Because while they were over there in Europe, all these kids were like, hey, look, we love your stuff. We love everything that you're doing, but we can't find your record. How do we get your record? And so Kurt was like, look, we need something that has more distribution so the kids can get a hold of our stuff. So with new material, they began contacting major labels. And Kurt, too, is kind of getting frustrated with Chad Channing, who was their drummer, because he thinks that Chad lacks power. And he wants a drummer with more power. So he reluctantly ends up firing Chad from the band. And Kurt hires Dave Grohl, who becomes the new drummer at the behest of Buzz Osborne from the Melvins. So Buzz is kind of, intertwined with Kurt a lot. He's kind of pushing him along to get this stuff done.
I will have to add one thing just real quick to our younger listeners. See, back in the day, there was a thing called a record store. You couldn't go to YouTube or iTunes.
You actually had to go somewhere like the mall or to an actual building, and you had to walk in, and then you had to do one of these until you found what you were looking for. And then you had to actually take it, pay for it, take it out, and put it on your record player at home. Some of y'all have those, like, haha, look, I got a retro record player. And that's what they were. No retro about it. That was what it was.
That was it.
That was it.
Yep.
Or you'd have to get your videotape, and you'd have to call the radio station, request it, and hit record and play at the same
At the
time,
same time.
and hope that the DJ didn't talk over the first couple of words.
Yeah.
That, or hope the damn tape was even there was enough space left on the tape
On
that
the
it didn't
tape,
cut off.
there's nothing worse than you hit that record on that tape, and all of a sudden you hear it go click, and you're like, no, there's like 30 seconds left of the song. No, you ran out of tape. You didn't. You planned poorly. You'd have to wait till the next day for it to roll around again.
Or you have to call the DJ and annoy the piss out of them to get him to play the song
much.
again. So, but with Dave Grohl in the band, though, that's where the iconic Nirvana lineup was formed. Because when people think Nirvana, they think Kurt Cobain, Chris Novoselic, Dave Grohl. And they're finally ready to record on a major label. Now, at this time, Seattle was kind of getting attention from across the pond in Europe, because England had sent a journalist over with Melody Maker to do a story on the Seattle scene with all these bands that were doing different things in Seattle. And with that article being published, it generated so much buzz that major labels were beating down the door to sign Seattle bands pretty quick. And that's when Geffen Records came calling, and Nirvana signed with Geffen Records in April of 1991. And they went into the studio and began recording an album that would define the 90s and define a generation, and that album was Nevermind. Now, Nevermind, launched Kurt and his band into superstardom, because, they were just this little punk band touring before, but now they are the it thing, and they are the band. So Kurt is launched into superstardom because this was music by Outkast for Outkast. The scrawny little blonde punk rock kid from Aberdeen was now a major playmaker. And with the release of this album and the single Smells Like Teen Spirit, Kurt had unwittingly became the spokesman of a generation. He gave a voice to the artistic and the downtrodden, and they were just like him, and they found solace in everything that Nirvana was doing, and found solace. And they're like, hey, if they can do it, I can do it, and inspired so many people to pursue their art and to be who they were and to be themselves. But this kind of proved to be a little bit too much. And so he kind of began to self-medicate, because on top of the stomach issue, he kind of didn't really know how to deal with all that level of fame coming at him. Now, and that's when Dave and Chris started to notice that Kurt was acting a bit strange, and they discovered that he had been using and trying to hide it. And what they didn't know was just how long he had been using, because he had been using casually for a few years in order to quell that stomach pain. And Kurt had been using, and now he was using more regularly, and Chris and Dave were concerned about their friend, and they talked to him about stopping, and Kurt swore up and down that he was going to stop, but as we all know, he did not. So he continues to use heroin, and as things are starting to escalate for Nirvana. And around the same time, another blonde musician began hanging out with the band, and her name is Courtney Love. And she and Kurt were attracted to each other instantly and were attached at the hip. Because Courtney, much like Kurt, had come from a broken home, and she was also a musician, so they kind of understood each other in their eyes. But like Kurt, she had a habit, and they began a drug-fueled whirlwind romance that would not end well eventually.
And that's very documented. Mm-hmm. That is very documented. Yeah. I recall opening up papers and seeing it, because, and just reading, the trash mags where they just say, here they are, here's a picture of them, da-da-da-da. They're all, So, yeah, that's a very well-documented addiction love story.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a really good documentary if you want to watch. It's called Montage of Heck, and it's on HBO Max. And you can see them, and they are really messed up together a lot. It's sad, because that drug is something that really gets a hard hold on people, and once it gets a hold of someone, it's very, very hard to shake.
Yeah, not many people come back from that.
No.
Really, really good point just made in the comments. Says that he wasn't used to the attention. Negative attention was what he was used to. In his eyes, negative attention is better than none.
That's absolutely right. I think you were spot on with that.
Yeah.
Good point, you guys.
Good comment, Melissa.
Absolutely. So he's a head over heels over Courtney Love. And in January of 1992, they were engaged. So it's pretty boom, 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 engaged. And then they get married in February of 1992 in Hawaii. And there were very few friends in attendance. They only had their closest friends. And shortly thereafter, later in that year in August, Kurt would become a father, and his daughter, Frances Bean Cobain, was born on August the 18th, 1992. Now, with the birth of his daughter, Kurt finds a new purpose in life, basically. Like, he wants to be this musician. He wants to do all this, but he could not be happier about the birth of his daughter. And he wants to be clean for his daughter. And so much to the fact that he actually checks himself into a detox center in the days leading up to her birth. And all he ever wanted was to be close to her and to be a good dad for her. But like we were saying, that addiction takes hold of someone, and they kind of, as good as they want to be, sometimes they're at its mercy. Mm-hmm. Exactly. So as you'll see, he kind of relapses a couple times leading up till when his life is over. Now, 5 days after Frances Bean Cobain was born, there was an article that ran in the LA Times, and it said that Courtney was receiving methadone during her stay in the hospital. And that was enough to draw the attention of the LA Child Services. And when they found out that Kurt and Courtney's drug use, they said it was an endangerment of their child. So they had to give up custody to a family member for a while. And they weren't even allowed to be alone with their daughter for a long time. And Kurt was absolutely devastated by this, but he cleaned up his act and got custody back of Frances Bean in March of 1993. So,
do we know where her middle name comes from? Because I remember when they announced that, everybody's going, her middle name is Bean?
So it comes from whenever they did the ultrasound on Courtney Love. He said she looks like a little bean. And they named her Frances Bean.
See, I did not know that.
I didn't know that either. That's kind of cute.
Oh, yeah. Now, after he gets custody of Frances Bean in March of 1993, he goes back into the studio and they record the follow-up to Nevermind in Utero. And they record this with punk rock legend Steve Albini. And this is, and the album would be called In Utero, and it would be released in September of 1993. Now, after the album, Kurt returns home and becomes the devoted dad again to Frances Bean. And he stayed absolutely glued to Frances, and he loved nothing more than playing with his daughter. And, but it was around this time that Kurt and Courtney kind of started to tire of each other. And friends said that she would abuse him verbally in front of their friends and abuse him verbally in front of Frances, but Kurt would just sit there and take it. And things came to a head on June the 4th, 1993, when cops came to the Cobain home. They arrived to find Courtney waiting for them, and she said she had gotten into an altercation with Kurt, and Kurt had pushed her, and she threw a glass of juice in his face. And Kurt was arrested, and Kurt was embarrassed because he never, ever wanted to be this type of person. Like, he was something I didn't kind of really go into. Like, Kurt was like very, very pro-feminist. He was he hung out with a lot of punk rockers and a lot of feminists, and he did not want to be seen as a wife beater whatsoever. And this like really embarrassed him.
It's what he grew up in it partially, so I mean he didn't want to turn out like that.
No, not at all. And it kind of had a bad effect on him because he was just like, look, I don't want to be this type of person. I don't want to be known as this type of person. And this is kind of when his wheels start kind of turning, and he's just kind of like realizing he's in a bad codependent relationship.
Well, but sometimes the poison you choose is actually the person you're with.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be the worst poison you can possibly have.
Mm-hmm. Now, he bails himself out of jail, and Courtney drops the charges, and things were quiet between the two for a while. But a few weeks later, a friend went over to their house and said that Courtney was throwing everything she could at Kurt. She was screaming at him and calling him useless because he couldn't come up with a song. And this was the environment that Kurt was stuck in. He really loved Courtney and he really loved his daughter, but he was upset he was being treated this way, and he didn't know how long he could sit there and endure it.
He loved the idea of being a family. It's just he had the wrong partner.
Yes.
They both had the wrong partners.
Yeah, they totally did. I mean, that's when your relationship is kind of built on that.
Yeah, they were each other's addiction, not each other's true love.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
That's a great way of putting it.
Yeah. And now it wasn't all bad around this time, because in the summer of that year, Kurt found out what a stomach ailment was, and the ailment was treated, and it was the one that had driven his addiction for so long. The doctor diagnosed it as a pinched nerve and due to Kurt's scoliosis, and everyone noticed that after his scoliosis, his scoliosis wasn't treated, but they treated what the pinched nerve was, that Kurt's mood increased drastically, that, he had been making plans about other things he was going to do in his life, and he was upbeat and he was happy, but he was still a full-blown user at that point. And, things continue to just kind of snowball from there. because around this time, he has to go on tour that fall. And they record their legendary Unplugged record for MTV live in front of. And if you haven't listened to the Unplugged record, which I'm sure if you're a fan of Nirvana, people have listened to that. It is fantastic. Go listen to that one. He was very pleased with what they had done with his band, and their success and respect were getting the success and respect that Kurt was getting was growing and growing every day. But when Kurt returned home from tour, things with Courtney got even rougher. She and Kurt began fighting about money constantly, and eventually Kurt reluctantly agreed to buy a $1,485,000 mansion in Seattle at the behest of Courtney, and he told his friends and family that he was embarrassed to live there, that he didn't want to live in such opulence, and he was happy to live modestly and play his music and play with his daughter.
Yeah, he kind of blows your grunge cred if you're living in a mansion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But he says, adversely, he was tired of fighting with Courtney, and he just did it so he wouldn't have to deal with it. And it was just easier to go along with her spending habit and just let it happen. And a friend at this time said that Kurt and Courtney were really not getting along, that Kurt was just with her because of Frances, and he was growing increasingly frustrated and talked a lot about divorce. And Kurt told his friend, quote, "She makes me feel like an emotional cripple." So this is not a good relationship.
No.
So kind of, on the heels of all this, they have to go on another European tour. And Kurt doesn't really want to go on tour because he's kind of exhausted from recording in utero and going on the US tour and having to deal with Courtney. And he doesn't really want to do this, but as a chance to kind of get out and just get away from everything, he decides he's going to go on tour in Europe. And they said that he was very listless and he was constantly just kind of tired on stage, and you could tell that he was dealing with a lot. He traveled on a separate bus that the other band wasn't traveling in because he was sleeping all the time. And
I think he's lagging. It's his internet.
I think so too. He'll hop back on here with us.
He'll get back in a second.
I think we've all been in one of those toxic relationships where you're more addicted to the person that you're with than you. I mean, there's no that you love them, but they're just not good for you and you're not good for them.
Right.
And this sounds like one of those poisonous relationships that not only causes you to spiral, but you to not only spiral, but in very bad self-destruction. We've all had that bad. You have to have that bad relationship so you know what that good relationship is when you see it.
Well, and another comment by Melissa. Again, Melissa, you're on it with the comments. We appreciate it. It just says it was a toxic relationship. He wanted change. She didn't. In addiction, you have to change your people and places. Otherwise, relapse is inevitable.
That's right.
And that's absolutely true. But when you're in that relationship where you're not the true love or the best thing, I'm not gonna go as far out on the limb to say they weren't true love, anything like that. They had their own feelings.
I'm not
about
saying
that.
They didn't love each other. They just weren't good for each other. But
when you're each other's addiction rather than, you get where I'm going with that. I mean, Melissa, you're right on target with what you were saying. Anyways.
And I can absolutely see how whenever he comes back from all these tours, that is she angry with him? Of course she is. She's been left behind. She's taking care of the new baby. He's never here. Okay, we've got to get paycheck, but I never see you. And then, I mean, just as any spouse does whenever their spouse travels, it's like, hey, whenever you're here, I need you to pay attention to me. Well, honey, I'm tired. I'm too tired to even see straight. Let me rest. And okay, if resting's more important to you than I am, you've been gone. You hear this argument happening. You've probably had this argument at some point. We all have. So, yeah. I can see how the resentment would grow.
Yeah, I can too. Is Brian frozen again already? I believe that he is. We're going to hear the end of the story, I promise.
We are going to hear the end of this story. Turn your internet off, Ryan, and run off data.
Yeah, if you can hear us.
That's the best way to do it. So there were a lot of things because Kurt Cobain got really big whenever I was... Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
I'll tell this story in a minute. Go ahead, Ryan, because I want to hear the end of this.
Yeah.
Oh, no, you're totally fine. So on March the 1st, he blows his voice out and is ordered by his doctors to get rest immediately. So they have to cancel the rest of the tour, and he flies to Rome and he actually flies to Rome to meet with Courtney and his daughter, even though things were bad with Courtney. And he just really missed his daughter and wanted to see his wife and wanted to see, just kind of wanted some semblance of normalcy. So he goes to Rome, and he and Frances and Courtney go sightseeing all day. And that night, Frances is giving over to her nanny, and Kurt and his wife retreat. They go to their suite and they go to party. And they ordered several bottles of champagne and had a bellboy go fill a Rohypnol prescription there in town. And Kurt and Courtney drank and partied all night and took Rohypnol and drank champagne. Now, Courtney wakes up the next morning. And when she wakes up the next morning, she finds Kurt unresponsive. He is absolutely not moving. And she said he had blood coming out of his nose. So she panics and she calls the front desk. And Kurt was called. The front desk calls an ambulance to come pick up. And Kurt was rushed to the hospital. Now, Courtney from the get-go starts telling everybody that this was a suicide attempt, even though she didn't have any really real basis on it. Now, she said,
but a suicide attempt sounds better than we were doing Rohypnol and champagne all night. That takes any kind of reason for her to be involved off her. Oh, it's a suicide attempt. He wasn't happy. He intentionally overdosed.
Yeah,
exactly. Now, so they go to the hospital. Kurt goes to the hospital, and they save his life. They pump his stomach, get all that out of there, save his life. And he's actually out for a couple of days. And he wakes up in the Roman hospital, and he has several tubes running down his throat, and he can't speak. And he just scrawls on a piece of paper and hands it to Courtney that says, "Get these fucking tubes out of me." And she orders to get the tubes out, and then he orders a strawberry milkshake. First thing he does when he wakes up. But the doctors, they surmised that it was an accident. They were like, look, this was not a suicide attempt. This was an accident. They partied too hard. Luckily, she was able to wake up and find him and get him in here, because this could have gone really south really quick. And they were like, look, he mixed too much tranquilizer with alcohol. And 3 days later, he was given a clean bill of health, and he flew home to Seattle, and things just went downhill after this incident. This is the actual start of the decline into the end of his life.
Mm-hmm.
Our point of no return.
When they get back to Seattle, Kurt and Courtney continue to fight. And on March 18th, 1994, police were once again called to the home when Courtney called and said that Kurt had locked himself in a room, and she said that he was threatening to commit suicide, and there were guns in the room. When the cops show up, Kurt is actually the one that let them into the house. He said he wasn't suicidal. He was just hiding from Courtney, and the cops pulled Courtney over for questioning. She admitted that she lied about the whole, him trying to commit suicide in the room. And when pressed why she did that, she said she was just concerned for his well-being. And they were like, hey, we understand, you kind of freaked out, but just don't be making false police reports. If you get into a fight, tell us it's a fight. Don't tell us that he's trying to kill himself. But they ended up taking the guns from the home when they left on that day. Now, since the whole Rome incident, Kurt's record label, they were getting real scared for him, because they were like, here we have the biggest rock star in the world. What are we going to do? All eyes are on him. We need to get him clean. So they orchestrate a intervention with Courtney and his closest friends. And on March the 25th, 1994, Kurt walks into a room containing his closest friends and family, and they told him that his drug habit was out of control and that he needed to go check into a drug rehab center in LA, and Kurt agrees to do so. But right before he goes to LA, him and his buddy go to a sporting goods store where he purchases a shotgun, because he says that there were stalkers around his house, and he just, he needed a shotgun for protection. So his best friend, Dylan Carlson, buys a shotgun and puts it in his name, because he knew that they wouldn't sell Kurt the shotgun, because Kurt had just had guns confiscated from his house a few days before. And Carlson said he bought the gun, and if he knew that Kurt was suicidal, he never would have bought the gun, and Kurt did not seem suicidal to him. And so he said Kurt had lots of plans for after rehab, but nonetheless, he bought Kurt the gun, and Kurt went home, put the gun in a closet at the house, and went to rehab in California that day. Now, Kurt checks himself into rehab, and 2 days later, his daughter and a nanny come to visit him, and this would be the last time that Kurt would see his daughter. That night, he plays with his daughter, that, the nanny and the daughter leave, and a couple hours later, one of Kurt's idols, Gibby Haynes from the Butthole Surfers, stops by. And if you're in Texas, you know the Butthole Surfers, especially everybody. I love the Butthole Surfers too. So
That
Gibby
sounds
Haynes,
dirty.
So Gibby Haynes from the Butthole Surfer stops by and he talks with Kurt about how someone that he knew had actually escaped that rehab center by jumping the wall, and they laughed about it because if Kurt wanted to walk out the front door, he could have. It was voluntary. You
It's
didn't have to be
voluntary.
there.
Yeah.
So after Gibby Haynes leaves, Kurt goes outside to have a cigarette and jumps the wall of the rehab center and jumps on a plane back to Seattle. Now, when he gets to Seattle, no one's home in Seattle when he arrives, and Courtney's been in LA detoxing herself at a hotel. So Kurt is free to do as he pleases, and he was spotted around town by several people, and all said he was in good spirits, and he was palling around with several friends and actually palling around with a few dealers when he got back to Seattle. And then no one saw him for a couple of days, and no one knew where he was. But that all changed on April the 8th, 1994, when Gary Smith, an electrician, comes to the Seattle home of Kurt Cobain and Courtney Love to install a security system. And he goes into this little room above the attic that was a greenhouse. And he looks into the door, and there he sees the dead body of Kurt Cobain clutching a shotgun. Kurt had died of an apparent suicide from a self-inflicted gunshot wound on April the 5th, the medical examiner determined. But Gary Smith, when he first called to talk about what happened to Kurt Cobain, did not call the cops first. He called his dispatcher at the electric company. The electric company didn't call the cops. The dispatcher at the electric company called radio station KXRX and told the DJ that you owe me really good Pink Floyd tickets for this. Kurt Cobain is dead. And the DJ was the one that actually called the cops and had the cops dispatched to Kurt Cobain's house. Now, when the cops get there, they find Kurt Cobain's body in the greenhouse. And to the right of his body, they find a kit where he had shot up containing syringes, cotton, a spoon. They find an apparent suicide note. And they find a can of Barks root beer that's 3/4 of the way full. And they are taking pictures and everything, and they just go ahead and call it a suicide. The icon of a generation is laying there dead, and officials say that Kurt Cobain ended his life by his own hand on April the 5th, 1994. Now, that's where the official story ends. This is where we start getting into a bit of the conspiracy. Now, I will say that everything I'm about to say is absolutely alleged. This is alleged. If you want to go further into this, there's a really good documentary called Soaked in Bleach you should go watch. There's a really good book called Love and Death you should go read. And it gets really into the minutia of this, but I'm going to give you a few things, and then we're going to get into the account of a certain PI that was hired by Courtney Love in order to track down Kurt Cobain.
Well, and
Now,
everything you're going to be referencing is documented somewhere by someone, and it's someone else's alleged theory. We are
exactly.
Ryan's going to be telling you what someone else has already put out there. Now, whether or not we agree with it,
we're about to find out. So, initially, I'm just going to say this right now really quick. The Seattle Police Department, it was a rush to judgment. They had the biggest rock star in the world on their hands, dead in their town. They had the media attention of the whole world on them. And they go in, they kind of look and see what everything looks like, and they immediately go, suicide, get the heat off of us. We don't want anything to do with this. So they did not do a thorough enough investigation in order to determine exactly what happened. Now, when the cops find Kurt Cobain's body, he's clutching a shotgun. The shell casing from the shotgun is laying to the left of his body. It should be laying to the right of his body if the shell cartridge discarded after he shot himself. So that was another weird thing. When they go and they dust the gun for fingerprints, they do not find any legible fingerprints on the gun, nor do they find any legible fingerprints on the shell casing. And they also do not find any legible fingerprints on the pen that was used to write the suicide note that was laying next to the suicide note in the greenhouse. Also, someone at the time was attempting to use Kurt's credit card between April the 5th and April the 8th when he was dead and when his body was found. To this day, they still have not been able to determine who had Kurt's credit card and who was using Kurt's credit card at that time. No one has been able to find out. Also, he had more than 3 times the lethal amount of heroin in his bloodstream. According to the Seattle Intelligencer, his blood, the PI was able to get his hands on a report from the Seattle Intelligencer, and it said that his blood morphine level was 1.52 grams per liter, which is 3 times the lethal amount of heroin that would have killed anybody. So he would have been incapacitated, and he would not have been able to write a suicide note and then shoot himself if he had injected that much heroin into his bloodstream. That is 75 times the lethal dose to kill the average person. How would he have been in any condition to shoot himself? There's no way.
Are we discussing yet or not?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Joey's like,
because I'm giving you that little bit of information.
Yeah, okay. We'll be quiet. We'll be quiet.
And at the end, we're going to kind of tie it all up, and then we'll discuss.
Okay.
Now, on top of that, we also have the account of private investigator Tom Grant. Now, Tom Grant was hired. Tom Grant was a former sheriff's deputy in L.A., and he also worked the specialized crime unit, busting felonious crimes in California. In 1993, he starts his own private investigation firm, and Grant was hired by Courtney Love after Kurt left rehab in the days leading up to his death. Now, Grant taped many of his conversations that he shared with Courtney and a lot of Nirvana's inner circle. So, to begin his account, on April the 3rd, 1994, the phone rings inside of his office. A woman on the other end of the phone says she is famous and does not want to give her name, and says says someone is using her husband's credit card and he needs him to look into it. And she wants Grant to find out who exactly is using her husband's credit card. So Grant drives to meet this person at the Peninsula Hotel, and when he gets there, Courtney Love is the one that opens the door and greets Grant. She tells Grant that she actually lied on the phone, that her husband is missing, and she wants Grant to call the credit card company to get a list of transactions. And she tells Grant about this, and Grant's like, look, actually you could call the credit card company and get the list of transactions if you wanted to. And she's like, no, I want you to. So Grant agrees to. So he goes back to his office to get a piece of paper that she needs to sign in order for him to look into certain things. When he gets back, she is absolutely hysterical. She has called and looked into the credit card transactions and says that when Kurt left, he bought 3 airline tickets when he left LA and doesn't understand why he bought 3. And one of the 3 he used to fly back to Seattle, and she starts speculating that he may have bought a ticket for someone else. She asks Tom to hack into the airline computer system to get a name off of the ticket, and Tom refuses and says, no, I'm not going to do that. Everything I'm going to do by the book. Courtney then tells him, I think Kurt wants a divorce. If he wants one, that's fine. I would win in a second. And she said that Kurt left her a note in Rome when he overdosed on Rohypnol that said, she said in the note, he said he was leaving me. And she fears that Kurt is having an affair with Seattle heroin dealer Caitlin Moore. She asked Tom to bug Caitlin's house. Tom, again, refuses to do that. He's like, I'm not bugging someone's house. That's illegal. I can't do that.
Jeez Louise.
And she also tells Tom about a prenup that her and Kurt had signed before the wedding. She admits to Tom that she planted a false story in the press that day, which this is documented too, that there was a story in the press that said that Courtney had an overdose and was in a hospital in L.A. But she tells Tom that she planted the false story, that she OD'd in L.A. and said it was to get Kurt's attention, but then switches and says that she has a record coming out next week and, quote, maybe it would help her sell a few records. So Tom's just kind of like,
whose account is this? This is the PI's account.
This is the PI's account, yes.
Okay.
And so he's kind of starting to be like, what? Red flags going up for him already.
Right.
Now, she told him when she called him that Kurt had not been seen, and she didn't know where Kurt was, and that's why she called him to track him down. But we're going to go back a day, just a sec, to show that, according to Tom Grant, this was a lie, because Kurt arrived in Seattle on April the 2nd, 1994, and he went to the house, and there he went into the live-in nanny for Francis Bean Cobain. There was a guy named Michael Callie DeWitt who was living in the house. He says that he saw Kurt that morning, that Kurt sat on the edge of his bed, and he told Kurt to call Courtney because she's freaking out. And Callie claims that Kurt tried to call Courtney's hotel, but couldn't get through. Now, according to phone records, Kurt did not try to call Courtney's hotel. There was no calls outgoing from the house, from the home phone, going to Courtney's room. Sorry, I almost said Courtney. going to Courtney's room. Now, however, Courtney did make several calls to Callie's private number that day, and some lasted for several minutes. So what's weird about this is she told him that he hadn't been seen. So why did she contact him in the first place saying, you know, hey, my husband hasn't been seen? And she didn't tell him that Kurt had been seen the day before at the residence. And she was so concerned about having Tom stake out Caitlin's place. Why not the house? If Kurt had been seen at the house, why didn't she want him to stake that place out? So going back into the 4th, on the 4th of the 4th of April, 1994, Courtney calls Tom the next morning and she gripes about recent fights with Kurt over money. And she's angry because Kurt turned down a $9 million bid to play Lollapalooza that summer. And she wasn't really sounding too concerned about his well-being. She was just kind of talking about money. And then she also brings up Caitlin again. And she suspects that Caitlin is supplying Kurt and giving him money to stay in a hotel maybe. And she again emphasizes watching her apartment. But, you know, it's just like Grant again is kind of like questioning the reason why she was like hammering home Caitlin's apartment so hard. Also, she admits to Grant that she called the Seattle police and she pretended to be Kurt's mother and filed a missing persons report, which is true and documented. Like if you read anything leading up to Kurt's suicide, it says his mother placed a missing persons report.
So she's having no problem falsifying police records.
Yeah.
No.
Or filing false police reports.
No. And in the missing persons report, she tells the Seattle Police Department that he may be suicidal. And Grant, in retrospect, thinks that it was interesting she keeps hammering home the suicide thing as well.
That's exactly what I was just thinking.
Mm-hmm. On April the 5th, 1994, the day that Kurt is estimated that he died, Grant starts calling Seattle hotels to see if Kurt is staying anywhere. He gets a hit at the Western Evergreen Hotel, and someone is using one of Kurt's favorite aliases and is checked in at that hotel. He calls Courtney and tells her, hey, I've got this hit. I'm going to call and check it out. And she tells him no, that she'll call and check it out. And so he's like, all right. So she calls him back and says that she called and Kurt is not staying there. And Grant finally asked her, he's like, you know, why haven't you offered me to go to the house and surveil the house? And she's like, oh, well, Callie is there and he'll tell me if Kurt shows up. Which, again, Grant learned was also another lie. Because Callie had stopped staying at the home on the 4th. And he had been staying at another girl's apartment. And phone records indicate that Courtney knew this because she called that girl's apartment several times throughout the week while Callie was staying there. So why wouldn't she let Grant surveil the house? So on the 6th, Grant offers to fly to Seattle to have boots on the ground to actually start doing some legwork and looking for Kurt Cobain. Courtney okayed it. So he flies to Seattle and he links up with Kurt's best friend, Dylan Carlson. That night, with Courtney's permission, Grant and Dylan go into the home and search the home. Now, Dylan and Grant walk through the home looking for Kurt, and Courtney wanted them to search for anything they could possibly find, and they actually find a packet of Rohypnol, Rufinol, whatever it's called, in one of the nanny's bedrooms. And Dylan says it's what Kurt OD'd on while he was in Rome. Now, the whole time they are in this home, Kurt Cobain's dead body is laying in the greenhouse out back. And people have often questioned Grant, like, why didn't you go look in the greenhouse? And Grant said that you couldn't see the greenhouse from the road, especially on a rainy night. And if it was dark, you couldn't see it. And other journalists did go by there, and they confirmed that you could not see that greenhouse. You wouldn't even know it was there unless somebody told you it was there. So they leave the house. And on the next day, on the 7th, Grant and Dylan end up searching some of Kurt's old haunts. And around 8 p.m., Dylan calls Courtney. She tells him she wants he and Grant to search the home one more time. This time, she wants them to look for a hidden part of the closet where the shotgun will be kept that Kurt bought earlier that month. And now Grant is suspicious again because he's like, we already searched the home. Why do you want us to go back? So he also is thinking, why hadn't you asked Callie to look for the gun earlier that week? And why didn't she ask them to look for the gun the previous night when they were there? When they get into the home, they actually find a note that is sitting on the stairs that Callie wrote that says, you know, I can't believe you've been here this whole time without me knowing that you're here. You're a real asshole, man. Get your shit together. Call your wife. And they're like, we were just here yesterday. This note wasn't here. This is interesting. And so Grant thinks that he was meant to find that note, even though it makes no sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Courtney wanted him to go back to the house. And they looked, but they did not find the shotgun. So the next morning, on the 8th, Grant and Carlson learn of the tragedy as they're driving around looking for more places to look for Kurt. And they report that Kurt had been found in the greenhouse. And that's when Grant asked Dylan Carlson, what greenhouse? And Dylan Carlson was like, I didn't even think about it. There's a little room above the garage where they keep lumber in. I didn't even think about the greenhouse. So he drives to the crime scene and starts trying to talk to some of the detectives that are working the crime scene. And while he's at the crime scene, Grant calls his partner back in LA to see if his partner had dug up anything. His partner tells him that about the credit card being used. That's where that whole credit card thing comes from. And Grant goes to the detective that is over the case and tells that detective, hey, I've got this information. The detective does not want to hear anything Grant has to say and makes him leave. So Grant's like, no one wants to listen to me, so I'm just going to go back to LA. So he goes back to LA. And while he's back in LA, he's able to get a meeting with someone who is very close to the Nirvana camp. I'm not going to mention this person's name. If you want to know who it is, go watch the documentary. She was really good friends to Kurt and Courtney, and she didn't believe that Kurt was suicidal. Slightly before the death of Kurt Cobain, she said that Courtney called her and wanted this person to find the meanest, most vicious divorce lawyer that she could possibly find, and asked if there was any way that she could void the prenup that she had signed with Kurt before they got married. And incidentally, right after that, she gets a phone call from Kurt, who asked if he could take Courtney out of the will. And so you're having, a lot of problems. They're calling and they're trying to get each other taken out of.
She can obviously tell that there's tension.
Something's going on. Exactly.
Something's happening.
She also says that Courtney would not let her see a copy of the suicide note, but Tom had a copy and let her take a look at it. She said it looked like someone had tried to copy his handwriting, and it was almost like a patchwork of things he had written in the past that were cobbled together and put into this note. Now, she goes into another room and she comes back. And Blake, I sent you a picture of this writing sample. And she produces a writing sample that she said was left in Courtney's backpack. And that Courtney had tried to copy. It looked like she was trying to copy Kurt's handwriting. And if you look at the last two lines of the suicide note, it looked like that Kurt had actually not written the last two lines of the suicide note. And the writing sample kind of looked like some of the last two lines that were on that suicide note. So Grant gets a hold of this, and it's sent off to a handwriting analysis person. Now, Heidi Harrison, who is a forensic document examiner, takes a look at the writing sample and the suicide note, and she said that the practice sheet had specific letters and letter combinations found in the last two lines of the note. And she says that it's entirely possible that the last two lines could have been a forgery, where someone else was trying to use, a writing sample where someone else had written instead of Kurt Cobain. So that is the account of Tom Grant and the account of everything that he was able to dig up. Lastly, we have the account of Eldon Hoke, a.k.a. El Duce. And Blake, if you want to throw his picture up, I got his picture. So this guy right here.
Well, he's a character.
Oh, yes. Eldon Hoke, a.k.a. El Duce, was the lead singer of a band called The Mentors in L.A. He had a reputation for doing anything for a buck. So people would come and have him do whatever they wanted to do. And he claims in December of 1993, he was working at a record store, and Courtney Love drove up to the record store in a limo where he worked and said to him, quote, "I need a favor. My man's been a real asshole lately. I need you to blow his fucking head off," quote unquote. And she said she offered him, so he said that Courtney Love offered him $50,000 to do a job and kill Kurt Cobain. He agreed and went inside to grab a card, and he gave her a business card and said that whenever she was ready to call him at the store, and that's where he would take his messages. Now, the other guy working at the store confirms that he saw El Duce and Courtney Love talking out front, but he did not hear the conversation that they had. So Courtney Love was at this record store. These two guys can confirm. El Duce says that he believed that she was just blowing smoke and he had completely forgotten about it. But Courtney called the store looking for him in March of 1994. However, he was on tour and was not able to take the message. And then in March of 1996, El Duce undergoes a lie detector test administered by Edward Gelb, the same guy that administered the lie detector test to O.J. Simpson in 1994. And he passed with 99.1% accuracy. When asked, was he asked to kill Kurt Cobain? And he said yes, and he passed completely. Flying colors. Now, shortly after this, Nick Broomfield is making a documentary. Now, Nick Broomfield is a fantastic documentarian. He made a documentary about Eileen Wuornos. If you haven't seen that, go check that one out. Mm-hmm. He starts doing a documentary about like the conspiracy angle of what happened to Kurt Cobain. He goes and interviews El Duce. And El Duce tells him in the documentary that he was offered money to kill Kurt Cobain, and he didn't do it, but he knows who did, and he accidentally lets the name Alan slip when he is talking about it. He's like, I told my friend Alan, actually my friend, I'll let the FBI catch him, ha ha ha. And he pulls it back and doesn't really say the name again. 8 days later, El Duce is hit by a train and dies. So he's silenced forever. So, in summation, Tom Grant believes that Kurt Cobain was murdered and that no one wants to listen, even though they have all this evidence. I will tell you what I think in a minute, but I want to know what you guys think about the whole thing.
And I'm going to let Shelly jump on this because she is chomping at the freaking bit. Hold on, your mic is muted, girl. Hold on, I got you. Oh, I can't unmute your mic.
Unmute your mic. We can't hear you.
There you go.
There you go.
Well,
there you
I was writing notes down because I didn't want to forget anything. Okay, so if this PI is to be believed, mm-hmm. And he isn't just out to make a buck, why, whenever he finds out that there is someone at a hotel, why does he not physically go and check it out? Why does he allow Courtney to go, oh no, I'll go check it out? It seems as if she needed someone to say, yes, the credit card was being used here. Again, you got to establish an alibi. You got to establish somewhere to go with, you have to establish somebody says, oh yes, we knew that. Mm-hmm. That gives you plausible deniability. Also gives you reasonable doubt if put in front of a jury. Why is it that she suddenly remembers to ask about the shotgun after she sends him back? She sends him back under the pretense of that, correct? And that's when he finds the note, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the note was not there. This is whenever he goes back, that's the second or the third time he's been in the house.
That's the second time
he's been in the house where he says, hey, and it's funny because I don't know if you caught this or not. The language that you used in the note, call your wife, you're an asshole, call your wife. Mm-hmm. The El Duce guy says, my husband's being a real asshole. You got two people using the exact same terminology that's supposed to come out of one person's mouth. That syntax matters. Mm-hmm. Syntax matters. The way you use words, the repetitive the repetitive words that you use, that makes up your vernacular, your what's it called? Your vocabulary, mm-hmm. Vernacular, is that what it's called?
Vernacular, yeah.
Vernacular, yeah.
So, anyhow, so that is very telling that you have a note written by someone who would say, you're an asshole, and someone else that says that it came out of Courtney's mouth, my husband's being an asshole. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I don't think, I wouldn't leave to my friend, hey, you're being an asshole, I'd be like, your man's driving me nuts, call him. Mm-hmm. I don't think I would necessarily insult my friend on it. Mm-hmm. And also, why is it 2 days before she's the one who makes him aware that there's been charges on a credit card when she could very easily have called on that credit card herself? Mm-hmm. And it's, again, there's a lot of turning wheels in this. And I think the handwriting sample, I don't necessarily think that with the handwriting sample that can be conclusive that she had anything to do with this suicide note. Because if, and I do say if, there goes he again, if she was concerned about being cut out of the will, how better than to be able to sign his name on a new will that could be discovered after his death? Oh no, he left it all to me. I wouldn't necessarily think that would be involved in some kind of Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
Involved in some kind of a plot. Now, however, if you've ever watched any kind of Murder Channel stuff, it is very difficult to shoot yourself with a shotgun.
Mm-hmm.
Most people's arms
Extremely.
are not long enough to put it wherever it's put, and then at the correct angle in order to kill yourself right away, get your finger or your thumb or even your foot in the correct position to pull that trigger. The fact that there are no prints on the pin. The no prints thing is what makes me, now granted, I don't know, heroin user, can you burn your fingers enough you burn off your fingerprints? But there still should be some kind of bodily fluid of some kind that matches you. The lack of prints, that screams more to me as setup than anything else. So that's my theory.
The first dead giveaway, I'm sorry, is it just seems like we're having deja vu, from 3 weeks prior that we talked about the level of a drug in somebody's system being so insanely high that it's okay. Even I don't care. Obviously, the drug had to be, let's just say, administered prior to him potentially shooting himself.
What can I throw something on this, Blake? Something else that was interesting was that they said that the Rohypnol was found in the nanny. Why the hell would the nanny have any Rohypnol? Could it have been that she had taken the baby over to see him, slipped him the drink, made the phone call, it's ready, somebody goes over while he's out, overdoses him, stages the crime scene, and is gone?
No, but the only thing is she was accounted for at the hotel because she was detoxing herself. The
nanny was? The nanny was
no.
That's what I'm saying. The nanny. You said that the nanny had Rohypnol, the same kind that was found at their house. What was the nanny doing with Rohypnol?
That's true. Yeah.
So the easiest person, now let's lay it out, the easiest person to get access to him anytime she wanted, would you like me to bring over Frances Bean?
Well, I think Frances Bean, I do not know where she was at this point. I think a nanny was taking care of her.
She didn't have to be there.
But I don't know where she was at this point.
But the ruse to get in the door, I know if it was me as a parent, somebody says, hey, bring your child over to see you. Oh, okay, great. You know what? Yeah, whatever. Come bring him over. That would be the person with the easiest access, the unquestioned access that could have slipped it. And the fact that you said that the nanny had some in her possession, that bothers me right there.
My whole thing is I don't what I hate is the mounting pressure that they use. Again, here we are with the mounting pressure to come up with an outcome. I mean, you have to look at it as the amount of lethal drugs that he had in his system. Excuse me. No matter what order he went in throughout the night, obviously we know that the last thing that happened was him turning a quote unquote turning a gun on himself, allegedly. And so because he would have had to have a self-inflicted gunshot wound. So whether he either wrote the note beforehand, then shot up, or shot up, then wrote the note, it's implausible to happen because if you watched anything over documentaries or been around anybody who has used before or been in the same vicinity, I mean, the moment things hit your system, you're out. Oh, yeah. There is no next step to be able to grab a weapon of some sorts to do anything to yourself.
No.
I'm sorry. That right there is number one.
Especially a weapon that's allegedly hidden.
And something else? They never tested the contents of that Barks root beer can either. That was 3/4 of the way empty. They never tested those contents. That's
where the Rohypnol was. I'm telling you.
So I will tell you exactly what I think.
Blake has one more. He had a point too.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
You said number one, the mounting pressure.
No, they
have to find an answer. And you said number two.
That's where that's where I was going. Like, I may not have said number one, number two, but and I got my points out.
Okay.
Yeah. No matter what the order was, the ending, the way he was found, the ending would have been a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He would not have been coherent enough to be able to cause a self-inflicted gunshot wound. I'm sorry. That's my take on it.
Okay. Well, I wanted to make sure we got all yours because if I plan on arguing with you, I have to know what I'm going to argue about.
And that's something else too, is they never, and that's another point that Tom Grant makes. He's like, why not just take all that heroin and never wake up? Why would you then shoot yourself as well? He's like, it
Overkill.
just makes no sense.
Overkill.
But what I think, and like
Be very cautious with how you phrase it.
say what I think is, or my theory is that I don't necessarily, I think at the very least, this is what I'm going to say. I think at the very least, I think I can explain the handwriting sample.
Spit it out, man.
So the handwriting sample, think about the company, like, at the time, both of them were junkies, and they probably kept very rough company. So I think the handwriting sample could have been her maybe trying to get his handwriting down to maybe forge his name on a document.
That's what I said whenever you popped out. Perhaps after he signed his will and kicked her out, that perhaps she was going to sign another one to be miraculously found.
Yeah, like maybe, I mean, that's my theory on that. My other theory is at the very least, I think somebody knew he was dead. And I think that she knew he was dead. And I think that they may have just not known how to handle it. So they just tried to, they were just like, oh, I didn't know. You know what I mean? Like they may not have not known. They didn't know how to handle the death of the biggest rock star on the planet.
Somebody knew. You have the biggest rock star, the voice of a generation, has not been seen for at this point a day or two.
4 days, right? The second he flew in, and he wasn't found until
he wasn't found until the 8th.
Till the 8th, so 6 days.
Somebody knew. Somebody knew, and somebody knows. I'm sorry. That's all that's where I'm gonna leave it. Is somebody knew and somebody knows more than what they're saying, because nothing lines up with this from the get-go.
I think maybe someone, like I said, maybe someone like freaked out, like saw him, because I think that explains the credit card usage too. Like, somebody maybe have stumbled in on that and been like, oh shit, he's dead. Well, I bet his credit card's still active. You know what I'm saying?
That's a big risk, especially when his wife at the time said that they would go to the room themselves and check out who was in there and refused to let the PI. If somebody taken my credit card, go find that son of a bitch and arrest them. Now, there's one thing that okay, so the gun. Okay, the gun becomes very pivotal here, because what was the reason that Kurt wanted a gun? He said that he was dealing with a lot of stalkers, a lot of crazies trying to get in and around his house. Gets the gun for protection. His friend buys it in his name. So, but Courtney says that it's Kurt's gun. Well, yes, it is, but someone else bought it in someone else's name. So that in itself becomes kind of a tricky thing. But is it possible that we all know how crazed stalkers have been? The girl from My Sister Sam was murdered by someone who was obsessed with her. Could it have been that someone legitimately got on that property and Cobain had gone to get the gun, and perhaps in a heroin-induced stupor could not, and the gun was taken away from him, and perhaps he was killed. And in order to cover it up, perhaps a random intruder genuinely could have killed him.
Yeah, like
Ryan, can I? Because I don't think I've ever read this deep far into it, and I'm only assuming that you have. Without going into it, we're talking about Kurt Cobain and all that stuff. So without going graphically into it, do you happen to know what the scene of the crime looked like? Was he laying there? Was there?
He was.
Let me be very blunt. Was there blood splatter?
So he was laying on his back. There wasn't really something that's kind of been interesting too to me, and I think it was because of maybe the caliber of the shotgun shell that he used. There was not a whole lot of damage to his head or face. Basically, he just like shot himself and like it fucked his brain up and killed him. Like, I don't know if a shotgun
is to open up your head and splatter it. Those BBs are made to go. Mass damage.
Yeah. So if I remember correctly, I mean, because there are crime scene photos that the Seattle Police Department has that they haven't. Right. But if I remember correctly, I want to say I read somewhere that there was surprisingly little damage. There was some blood, but there was surprisingly little damage to his head, even though he had shot himself.
I have one more theory to throw out there.
That's fine. Go ahead, because the wheels are turning.
So also, I also heard when in telling this story, the PI's account, that she wanted Cobain's alleged drug dealer to be, and she
Staked
names
out.
she names a name. Truly, if this was a dealer to the celebrities, you go telling their business and putting their name out there, that alone could get you whacked. So could it have been that somebody might have broken in for her and came across him?
I don't know. That's
the hardest thing. This things still don't add up, because then at that point, how do you explain the overdose? How do you explain the gun? How do you explain
it's cover up?
So a lot of people say, and what they say is that she had something to do with it, is what a lot of people say.
That is what is alleged.
That's what is alleged. However, I don't think that she did. I think that they were junkies. They kept rough company. The reason why Tom Grant keeps catching her in lies is because she's smacked out of her mind. She can't keep things straight. I think they kept rough company, and maybe somebody sees this opportunity and
like took
I said,
her at her request.
Not necessarily that. I don't think she had anything to do with it. I think.
But wait, El Duce says that she offered him X amount of money to kill.
He says that. I mean, but here's the thing too: is like I think he believes that.
And
you
he
see what I'm
very
saying?
well might believe that. However, what makes me believe it is the wording, the syntax of what he says and what is in that letter.
So what I was going to say is, it's alleged that she had something to do with it. I don't think that's true. I don't think she had anything to do with it. I think that, like I said, they kept rough company, and maybe somebody just seized the opportunity because, like I said, somebody was using his credit card up until his body was found. So somebody's like, he's here on his own. He's here by himself. So why don't, and a lot of people say that suicide note did not sound like a suicide note in the first place. It just sounded like a note where he was talking about quitting music. That's what most people agree that's what it sounds like. And those last 4 lines, I love you, keep going, blah, 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 are the ones that don't look like his handwriting. So somebody who is close and somebody who knows them may have done something and just tried to cover their tracks as best as they possibly could have.
Could it have legitimately been he was partying with some of his buddies, he legitimately overdosed and died, and when everybody wakes up the next morning, they want to make it look like a suicide because they don't want him to be the one because if it's a suicide, then he becomes a tragic figure. If he overdoses, then he's just another junkie.
That's where I lean, is what I'm saying. I think maybe something went wrong, pretty much, and they didn't know how to cope, and they didn't know what to do about it. So they're like, "Fuck, we have a dead body on our hands."
You're basically saying there was an overdose with a staged suicide.
I think that's it. I think that
is a very, to me, if you want to go, because the rule is the simplest answer is usually the right one, and that is the simplest answer. That night he got back in. He had a couple of buddies come over. Hey, I'm back in town. Everybody gets messed up, and all of a sudden he's dead. So we got to make sure it looks like he committed suicide. And maybe they took turns injecting each other, and somebody just got it wrong.
And it's just like he got too much, and they were like, "We don't know what to do. Let's make this look like he did it himself."
Students.
Yeah,
they weren't like they were.
And like I said, the ire from a lot of Nirvana fans and a lot of people has been directed at Courtney Love for so many years. And I surmise, not necessarily surmise, my theory is that she didn't have anything to do with it. She didn't know anything about it. She didn't know it. She didn't really know anything about it. She just, she was not in the right state of mind herself. So she was dealing with her own shit. And then that was just maybe just something on top of it, all that. And the reason, like I said, the reason why she can't keep her story straight, when she's talking to Tom Grant is because she herself was detoxing, and so she was smacked out of her mind as well. So I think that people's ire is misplaced. I think maybe they need to look more into, did he have anybody over there? Was there anybody that can corroborate if he had anybody over there? Do we know if he had buddies at the house? Do we know if he had, people coming over?
It is just convenient that this happens before the security cameras are installed. Days before.
Also, shortly thereafter, that garage and that greenhouse were demolished. So
that removes any chance of finding any trace evidence later on.
Mm-hmm. So, like I said, I think you're kind of spot on with, there was a party, people were partying, doing what they were doing. Somebody gave him a little too much, or he had a little bit too much, and they're like, oh shit, what do we do? They stage it to look like a suicide, and they leave. And they're like, we'll let somebody else find that.
He's Kurt Cobain. Somebody will be able to check on him tomorrow.
Yeah. And that could also be why the last 4 lines look different, because they could be like, well, shit, we got to find, is there some kind of writing he maybe has laying around here that we could just like leave at the scene and add something to it?
Now, so here I go again. You got me another one. Could it have been a band member that he was saying, hey man, I was going to tell you this later. And look, I was writing this. I was trying to think of the right way to tell you guys I'm about to quit. There goes the meal ticket. Dude, Kurt, come on, let's party. We'll change your mind.
No, because Dave Grohl and Chris Novoselic never touched heroin, ever. And they,
to your knowledge,
it greatly affected them both. Like to this day, like in interviews, Dave Grohl.
I didn't say it had to be a band member.
Oh, you said
manager,
band member.
Promoter.
Yeah.
Someone who stood to lose a lot of money if he walked away, but could forever profit off of his memorabilia if he was truly a tragic figure. I mean, he's the author of the grunge movement. He's the sound of the grunge movement. He's the sound of a very angry generation.
I mean, I don't know. I just lean more towards it was an accident and they staged it to look like a suicide and went on along their merry way.
Read that question, Blake.
But of all the ODs in the history of music, no one has done a suicide cover-up.
No.
Look, I have my points. My points are on the entire other end of the spectrum from y'all.
Mm-hmm. I've thrown out every theory. I'm on every side.
Yeah. Now, and remember, these are all theories. This is not what we actually believe. This is just a theory that we're coming up with, trying to solve this for our,
My theory is a lot different, but
you're muted. You're muted.
He did it on purpose.
I did it on purpose.
Yeah, he did it on purpose. Because he said something that could get him into trouble. So he muted his mic on purpose. Remember, there are certain people around this that have been deemed to be litigious. So therefore, whenever we say alleged, and it is all alleged, and we are citing from different sources, however, we're discussing it. We're not saying anybody did anything, but there are certain people around this particular story that are extremely litigious. So therefore, everything that has been spoken about is documented somewhere in a documentary or through, we've been able to find someone else that wrote it down first. We're just discussing it.
We're just giving you the information.
This is my thing. This is where I'm settled on. I don't think that it was just let's shoot up. Oh my God, he OD'd. Oh my God, now we got to cover up.
We can all agree it's not a suicide.
Yeah, oh no, it's not a suicide.
I don't think
100%.
So.
100%. This is
okay.
Not a
Continue
suicide.
on, Blake.
I think that this. I think this was something that somebody has done. I can't speak too openly.
Just step around that. There is perhaps someone close to him that was involved. Is that what you're saying? Perhaps,
yeah. And that knew a lot more
than what they're revealing.
Than what they're revealing. I think that there is too much back and forth. There is too much. Just things don't add up with timelines, with statements. It's just too convenient that things are requested and then all of a sudden something else is found or discovered. I'm sorry, but the amount of drugs
too much
this man
smoke.
Yes, the amount of smoke that this man had in his, amount of drugs that this man had in his system. There's absolutely no way that he would have been coherent. He would have even been alive long enough, let alone coherent, to be able to do anything further. You can rule out any type of drug party. We got a suicide note, allegedly. So he's either going to be sitting there writing and all this kind of, writing this out, blah, 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 yada, yada, shoot up, and then I'm going to grab a gun and have a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Fucking bullshit.
I don't know if anyone's ever seen pictures of gunshot victims. The damage is massive and vast, and it is horrible. And for there to be minimal damage,
because my whole thing is that it's the opposite way around. Something happened to him, and the drug overdose was the cover up.
I am inclined to agree with you.
Maybe.
Well, gentlemen, I think on that. Because I think if we go too much farther, we could potentially get sued. So
I'm going to end up getting a little bit too heated.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Tune into Patreon. We'll let Blake say what he thinks there. So Blake, tell them where they can find us.
But once again, like I said, I'd like to reiterate that this is all alleged. This is all written down somewhere, and that we are just spitballing. This is not what we actually believe.
And I can't leave our listeners and our viewers on just a cliffhanger here. My opinion, I'm going to give my conclusion. My opinion on it is that, Ryan, do you know what the final verdict of his death was? Is it a suicide? Case closed, done and done? Bullshit.
And the Seattle Police Department refuses to reopen it. It was brought back up on the docket like not long ago. And
he just gave you his verdict.
Yeah.
He just gave you his verdict right there. My final verdict? Bullshit. Ryan?
I think
it's either bullshit or not bullshit. Bullshit or not bullshit. One word.
What? I can't sum it up in one word.
Okay, it's suicide or not? Bullshit or not bullshit? No. Blake says bullshit. I say bullshit. Are you bullshit or no bullshit?
On the suicide issue, bullshit.
Thank you. The bullshits have it.
Okay.
And right now, I can sit here and tell you in our comments that every one of these people that are watching right now
say the bullshits have it too.
Bullshit as well. Therefore, in my conclusion, that shit needs to be reopened back up. But that's just me.
I agree. Let's stir up some trouble.
I mean, it's 3 weeks later, we're having the same freaking conversation that we had about another extremely famous person who died with an insane amount of drugs in their systems with no way to self-inflict that amount. I mean, well, okay. In his case, yes, it could have been self-inflicted. He could have just shot up a massive freaking dose of it.
Then how did he get the gun?
That's my next point. How did he get the gun? There's too much shit that doesn't make sense. I call bullshit.
Bullshit.
Well, y'all, we hope that y'all have enjoyed our week
rants
over Kurt Cobain, our rants and raves. Yes, bullshit. I agree. Let's open this back up. That's what was just said in the comments. Anyway, whatever social media channel you are watching us from, make sure that you follow us across the page. We don't just use one page for whatever. Y'all know what I say. I say it every week. Go follow us across the damn board. Also, oh no, I don't have any other because we're all sold out.
We're all sold out of our investigations, but there is a new one that should be posted pretty soon concerning the October one at the Longview. In Longview at the Gregg County Historical Museum. There is a ghost walk involved with that too prior to the investigation. So
you get to see our acting skills on display.
And then another way you can go and hang out with us is to go and become a Patreon member. It's $5 a month. There are no tiers. It's $5 for everything. And if you want to know what kind of crazy antic that Blake and I are going to do this weekend, I got $5 says, it don't happen to me that it happens to Blake. So go become a Patreon member, $5 a month, and you can see what we really talk about. And Ryan, what else do they need to do?
Go rate and review us on anywhere you get your podcasts. Please, please, please do that. And please tell 2 friends and have them tell 2 friends. Spread the word. If you love what we do, continue to spread the word. And if you do that, we'll just get bigger and bigger, and we can bring you bigger and better stuff.
Like, share, and subscribe.
Yes.
And if you have any stories or photos or evidence or anything you'd like for us to review, we don't share anybody's evidence or anything like that. We don't steal it. It will stay between us, but you can email those stories, those evidence pieces over to theevppod@gmail.com. That's THEEVPPOD@gmail.com. And with that, I myself am Blake Smith with my friends, Miss Shelley Pruitt, Mr. Ryan Roberts. We will see you next Tuesday. Bye, y'all.
Bye, you
Bye,
guys.
guys.